Hello, everyone. Welcome to Climate Trade-Offs of Wastewater Management Strategies. This is our 10th webinar in the Ocean Sewage Pollution series. And this series is presented by the Nature Conservancy with support from the Reef Resilience Network and NOAA's Coral Reef Conservation Program. My name is Sherry Wagner, and I'm the training lead for the Reef Resilience Network and your host for today's webinar. We're very excited to be joined by Dr. Andrew Henderson, Senior Environmental Engineer at Eastern Research Group, and Sarah Cashman, Director of Life Cycle Services at Eastern Research Group. During today's webinar, Andrew and Sarah will share findings from their recent research, which involved synthesizing data from global sources and models for wastewater management to increase understanding of global opportunities for greenhouse gas mitigation. A little about the speakers. Dr. Andrew Henderson is an environmental engineer with more than 10 years of experience in systems thinking, fate and transport modeling, and application of life cycle assessment to large systems. Before joining ERG, he worked in both academia and government. For the UN Environment Program's Life Cycle Initiative, he co-chaired the Acidification and Eutrophication Task Force and served on the Cross-Cutting Issues Task Force. Dr. Henderson is the lead modeler for the project covered by this webinar. And Sarah Cashman is a vice president and the director of life cycle services at ERG. Her previous work has involved systems modeling of the environmental impact of drinking water and wastewater technologies for governmental agencies. She also specializes in direct emissions accounting for greenhouse gas inventories. Sarah supported the systems modeling and results development for this project. So thank you so much, both Sarah and Andrew, for joining us today. In addition to this webinar series, there's an online toolkit and online course to help managers better understand the threat of wastewater pollution and ways they can act. We invite you to explore these resources more on our website, which is reefresilience.org. So just a few housekeeping items for the webinar today. The webinar will be 1 hour. It's being recorded, and we'll send out the recording to the mailing list after the webinar and also post the recording on our website. After the presentation today, we'll have a discussion session. There are 2 ways you can ask questions. You can type your question into the question box during the presentation at any time, and we'll save them for the end. Or you can also raise your hand during the question and answer session, and we'll call on you and unmute your microphone so you can ask your question. If you're having any technical difficulties, such as trouble hearing or seeing the slides that are being presented today, please type a message in the question box also, and we'll try to help you resolve the issue. Now we have a couple of poll questions we'd like to show you so that the speakers can learn more about who's joined the webinar today. Go ahead and launch the poll. The first question is, what's the focus region of your work? So go ahead and pick where you mostly focus on for the work that you do. And then once we get people voting, we'll go ahead and show the results. Okay, so it looks like almost half Caribbean Atlantic and a quarter Northern Hemisphere Pacific, and others split out, it looks like. So great, thanks for that. And we'll go ahead and run the second poll, which is just a way for you to tell us what kind of work that you do. Are you a marine resource manager? Are you a scientist or researcher, a student, or other? We can't, for these polls, have you fill in what the other is, so I apologize, but other is a fine category to choose as well as the others. So go ahead and pick your choice, and then we will show the results. Okay, so it looks like we have about equal number of managers and scientists, researchers, and then a handful of students, and then half of the group would be in that other category. So great, thanks so much for taking the poll. And now I think we will go ahead and get started with the presentation, and I'll pass it over to Sarah.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Sherry, and it's great to be here. Hi, everyone. We're really happy to share the results of our study, Climate Trade-Offs of Wastewater Management Strategies. Next slide. So just to provide some context in terms of the motivation of our work, we realize that climate change and greenhouse gas emissions are of particular concern for the environment and both human support systems. And we also realize that there's a lot of potential environmental impacts associated with marine systems. A large portion of the population lives near the coast, and sewage management near the coast can affect marine systems, including reefs. And so to understand human sewage management systems, it's important to really understand the environmental trade-offs of different options, because these are infrastructure decisions which can have really long lifetimes and be in place for a while. So it's good to have sound information to make decisions when deciding between these options. Next slide. So we had 3 specific research questions that we looked into in our study. The first one are, what are the environmental impacts, including greenhouse gas emissions, as well as other impacts associated with the collection, transport, treatment, and discharge of both treated and untreated municipal sewage globally. Next, we wanted to look at how these emissions vary by specific sewage management type. And lastly, we wanted to understand the implications, both the opportunities and the pitfalls of changing sewage management approaches. So next slide. Before we get into the detailed analysis, we wanted to just highlight some of our main findings. So we found that sewage management options do have different climate implications, as well as other environmental impacts. And it's important to emphasize that we are really focused on environmental impacts for this analysis, but of course that needs to be considered in the context of safety as well as social considerations of sewage. But the study today really focuses on environmental impacts. Some of the poorer performing sewage management types, especially from a climate perspective, were latrines and open sewers that are discharging sewage without treatment. And then we also found that primary wastewater treatment can have some negative impacts when it comes to eutrophication associated with nutrient discharges. When we consider both greenhouse gases, which is essentially a global impact, and also nutrient discharges, which can lead to eutrophication of water bodies, our findings suggest that a combination of container-based systems, which is an emerging technology that we'll discuss, as well as more advanced centralized treatment, such as secondary and tertiary wastewater treatment plants, may be the best pollution, provided that we can make improvements in some key system attributes. We found that no system had the best outcome in all of the different metrics we look at. There are definitely trade-offs among the sewage management options, which we'll discuss today. So next slide. So this slide just gives some context in terms of the types of sewage management occurring globally. So the darker shades here show global adoption of specific sewer management types according to the World Health Organization and UNICEF Joint Monitoring Program data. So you can see here that latrines, specifically dry pit latrines, are very widely implemented throughout the world. You can also see that we looked at some technologies that are not that widely implemented. So for example, we looked at container-based systems, which are not widely implemented at this time, but they're an interesting technology, emerging technology that we included in the assessment. I'll briefly touch on each of the options, but I'm sure in the discussion session we can talk about the specific technologies in more detail. So the specific sewage management options here are organized in terms of the relative safety in terms of sanitation. So of course, open defecation is an unsafe management method. And as we move along the table here towards advanced treatment, we see safer sanitation methods. Open defecation is the direct deposition of waste to the environment, either land or water. We looked at a number of pit latrine systems as well. These can be improved with a slab or unimproved. They can be lined or unlined. They can also be communal or household. And we looked at septic systems as well. Septic systems are connected typically to a toilet, and then a drainage pipe takes the sewage to an enclosed tank for further treatment. The container-based system is essentially a toilet with a removable container that is removed, and then the solids can be, for example, composted at a facility, and the liquid discharged to the environment. We modeled this in our study as sent down the drain, which may mean sent to the environment without further treatment, or it could mean that it is sent for treatment via centralized treatment, either secondary or tertiary, depending on the location of the discharge. So we modeled the container-based system solids as composted, but there are other possible options. So for example, they could be used for briquettes for heating. The urine could also be diverted, but we didn't look at these specific resource recovery options in our analysis. We also looked at 4 different options for sewage systems. So sewage systems are connected to a toilet, and then a drainage pipe will connect to a broader sewage sewer system network. The first option is that it's just sent to the environment with no further treatment after collection. And in this option, we also modeled open, sometimes stagnant sewer conditions. The next option we looked at was that the sewage is sent to primary treatment, which is primarily mechanical treatment, and then discharged to the environment. And the last 2 represent more advanced treatment options. So secondary treatment includes biological treatment that removes some nutrients. And then tertiary treatment includes both primary and secondary treatment, as well as additional nutrient removal, which we modeled using a membrane bioreactor technology. And for all 3 of the last sewer options, we also modeled these as closed sewer systems. Next slide. So this diagram here just shows the systematic approach that we took in our analysis. So we included all stages of sewer treatment, which may be different for the different options we looked at. So for example, we did look at open defecation because it is currently occurring, but that's just discharged directly to the environment. Whereas other systems have intermediate stages such as storage, transport, treatment, additional potential transport of the sludge, as well as additional sludge treatment that could be composting, anaerobic digestion, incineration, and so forth. Now, the liquids and solids may be released directly to water, either freshwater or marine environments, or to land. It is possible, depending on the location of the discharge, either to land or freshwater, that that emission eventually makes it to a marine system. So we took that fate and transport modeling into account. We also included indirect emissions in this analysis. So for example, electricity that's used in centralized wastewater treatment, that is included in the analysis, as well as upstream impacts associated with any materials, chemicals, or transport in the analysis. Next slide. So I'll just briefly touch on the scope of the results that we generated in our study. The main unit that we'll talk about today is all waste from one person annually going to one or another management option. It's important to note that we're only considering domestic sewage from humans in this analysis. So our analysis excluded industrial and commercial sewage and impacts from household food and chemical usage as well. We also scaled up these results based on current adoption of the different management options globally. So from this perspective, we can look at what are the total global impacts of sewage management, as well as when we consider population, we can then determine the per capita impacts. Our model is based on regional data, which is a combination of the UN Sustainable Development Goal regions and World Bank income levels. I'll talk about that in the next slide a bit more. But we essentially can then use that information to scale up the results by population to get global average data. And we'll present most of our findings today on a global basis. In terms of the different metrics that we looked at for results, our focus today is really on global warming potential, which looks at greenhouse gases and their ability to cause climate change over a 100-year time period. We'll also focus some of our results on eutrophication, which looks at potential damage to marine and freshwater environments from nutrient discharges, which can reduce available oxygen. Some of the other impacts that we looked at in our analysis include ocean acidification, which is an increase in concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which can lead to a decrease in pH in oceans, and obviously that can affect reefs as well. We also looked at terrestrial acidification, which is essentially acid rain that can damage terrestrial plant and species. And we also, the last two items for metrics here are particulate matter formation and pathogens, which can both cause human health issues. So particulate matter formation can cause respiratory issues, and pathogens also can cause disease for humans. One thing that's important to note is that we developed all of our data inputs to the model based on existing data from, for example, the JMP program that I mentioned earlier, IPCC emission factors, other governmental statistics, and life cycle databases and literature. So we didn't collect specific primary survey data for this project. It's just a compilation of existing data. Next slide. So this slide discusses the geographic scope of our model. So as I mentioned, we essentially combined the UN Sustainable Development Goal regions with World Bank income levels, which are categorized as low, mid, and high. And this results in specific regions that we can develop results for. And then we can use these regions to further develop population-weighted global averages. So just as an example here, you can see that for South America, most of South America is in the middle income category, and then certain countries such as Chile are in the high income category. Next slide. So now we'll get into some of our results. So this slide shows the global warming potential results by management option. So this is kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalents per global average user per year. So it's looking at if one global average user sent all of their sewage to one management option or another. So this lets us directly compare the different management options. Something we see here, and just to note that the management options here are shown on the x-axis, and then within each bar essentially are the different stages that we discussed earlier. So for example, storage is shown in green. So something obvious that we see here is that the pit latrines have high emission factors. We notice particularly that the wet pit latrine has a high emission factor. The dry pit latrine that's unlined can also be submerged depending on groundwater levels and can essentially act as a wet pit latrine. So it also has a fairly high emission factors. We see this because of stagnant conditions that can lead to essentially methane formation, and methane is a potent greenhouse gas. This is the same reason that we see relatively high emissions for septic systems. Container-based systems see relatively lower greenhouse gas impacts, primarily associated with solids transportation and composting. For the sewer no treatment scenario, there's some stagnant conditions in the collection stage. So we also see methane formation for this technology. And there are also some nitrous emissions associated with releasing the effluent to the water bodies. The primary sewer system has relatively low climate impacts. Again, most of the impacts are associated with nitrous emissions upon release. The advanced secondary and tertiary systems have somewhat lower GHG emissions compared to, for example, the latrines, but we do see nitrous emissions during biological treatment, as well as emissions associated with electricity inputs for centralized treatment. One thing to note here, we do include open defecation just because it is currently occurring. We do see that because it's not collecting large pools of sewage, that we don't see as much of the methane formation in our specific model, but we do realize that this graph needs to be understood in the context of safe sanitation, and open defecation is not a safe sanitation option. So next slide. So this chart shows the same results, but we've included low and high ranges for the different inputs to our model. So we can see that there is uncertainty in the results that we found, and that could potentially lead to higher emissions. But we can see that generally our findings that latrines have higher emissions are consistent, even considering uncertainty. We also conducted a sensitivity analysis for some of our advanced treatment options. So for example, the amount of electricity required for secondary and tertiary treatment and the types of treatment technologies. And we can see that there's a pretty big range on the advanced treatment options depending on the technology selection and the efficiency. So it's possible that the greenhouse gas emissions for advanced treatment could be further reduced either through use of renewable energy, different technology use, or efficiency measures. But the opposite is true too, that poorly managed advanced treatment technologies or different technologies could result in higher emissions as well. So next slide. So here we take a different perspective and we incorporate the current global adoption of the different management methods. So over to the right axis, you can see that we've now calculated the total global emissions here. And we found that there's approximately 660 million metric tons of CO2 equivalents released from sewage management annually. And you can see here what management methods are contributing the most to the total global emissions. So for example, because there's a lot of dry pit latrines in usage today, that has the highest impact in this chart. And actually we see that 60% of total current greenhouse gas emissions are from pit latrine systems when considering the different pit latrine systems that we modeled. Next slide. So we also looked at marine eutrophication, which is nutrient discharges to marine systems that can cause adverse effects to species due to oxygen availability. And we see it definitely trade-offs here. So in this case, we see essentially the highest impacts associated with the sewer no treatment and sewer primary system. This is largely because those systems are essentially acting as a funnel to discharge nutrients to water with little nutrient removal. Container-based systems also are essentially collecting the urine, and we model that as essentially dumping it down the drain, which may go to treatment or may be directly discharged to the water. So we see relatively higher impacts for marine eutrophication for container-based systems. And of course, if there was some type of urine diversion program, that could be mitigated. The latrines also, if they're emptied and sent down the drain, for example, that there could be additional impacts for latrine systems. And open defecation, the runoff, could lead to marine eutrophication as well. We see low marine eutrophication for systems like the septic system, as well as the advanced treatment technologies. Next slide. So here we just summarize all of the different impact metrics that we looked at. And then on the bottom here, you can see all the different treatment options. And we basically have color coded this. So red means there's a relatively high impact for that technology and that specific metric. Yellow is moderate and green is low. And this is not indicating any type of statistically significant difference, but just helps us understand some of the basic trade-offs between these systems for the particular environmental impacts that we looked at. So for example, we can see that the pit latrines have very high greenhouse gas emissions. We also see that they have high acidification and particulate matter impacts, and this is related to, for example, ammonia formation in the stagnant conditions. We can see that the septic system generally performs well, with the exception of the higher greenhouse gas emissions that we discussed earlier. The container-based system seems to perform well if we can mitigate the marine eutrophication concerns. The sewer no treatment and sewer primary have a number of different trade-offs, but the main one is that they lead to higher eutrophication potential. And then the secondary and tertiary treatment generally perform well. They do have somewhat higher greenhouse gas and ocean acidification, somewhat due to the use of energy, increased energy and especially electricity in treatment processes, but that could be potentially mitigated through steps that I previously mentioned. And again, this chart really needs to be considered in the context of safe sanitation. So you can see that there's movement towards the safe sanitation as you read across the options on this chart and the arrow shown here. Next slide. So we've mostly looked at global results so far. And on this slide, we're now looking at some specific regions. And we've coupled our regions with income level. So you can see the income level categories at the bottom based on the categories defined by the World Bank. One thing that we can note is the emissions that we see. And this is shown as a per person per year in each region, with the stacked bars representing the specific management options. So we can see that the sort of lower income regions have higher emissions from a greenhouse gas perspective. And this is primarily because of the pit latrines that we've discussed. So for example, you can see that the Central and South Asia bar is primarily dominated by that dark blue pit latrine unlined and the dry pit latrine lined. But we can also see different regional differences as well based on management method adoption. So for example, for the high income Europe and North America, we see that a lot of the greenhouse gas emissions are coming from the green bar, which is tertiary treatment. And then for sub-Saharan Africa, high income, which is primarily South Africa, we can see that it's mostly dominated by septic emissions and to some extent primary sewer systems. Next chart. So now that we've looked at the current situation for sewage management, we also wanted to consider future adoption scenarios. So this first column here is essentially the table I showed you before in terms of the adoption of the different sewage management options globally. Now looking at data from the past 10 years, we also extrapolated out a business as usual 2050 trend scenario. And you can see, for example, here, there's movement away from open defecation. So it's shaded a lighter color here. So it's moved from 9% of the globe is using open defecation, and now we're down to 3%. Similarly, there's some decreases in latrine usage, but there are some increases in septic systems, as well as primary treatment and secondary treatment. Now, the next future scenario that we looked at was safe sanitation, where everyone is transitioned to a safely managed option. So for example, there's a big increase in septic systems, as well as primary treatment and secondary treatment. And lastly, we looked at an option where there's still some unsafely managed methods, such as pit latrines, but then we're shifting quicker to secondary and tertiary treatment, bypassing to some extent primary treatment. And then for areas that don't have access to centralized treatment, for example, we're implementing container-based systems. So we'll look at just some overview results next for these different options. So here we can see the different results from a greenhouse gas perspective, a total global greenhouse gas perspective. So you can see that our current total 2020 global greenhouse gas for sewage was calculated to be 660 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents. If we consider the adoption changes that we just talked about, as well as population increase, which is projected to be about 25% between 2020 and 2050 based on medium UN projections, we see business as usual will increase greenhouse gas emissions about 33% for the sewage sector in this time period. However, for the safe sanitation scenario, that increase is less. The increase is about 12%, which is less than the increase in the population change. And then if we look at the container-based system and the advanced wastewater treatment system, we can see that we're actually coming in a bit lower than our current emissions, decreasing the overall impacts by about 11%. So not getting rid of them, but it is mitigating against the population increases included in this chart. So next slide. So now I'll just summarize some of our key findings. So based on the various environmental metrics we looked at, we did see that some of the poorer performers were latrines, especially given how commonly they're used globally, as well as open sewers, discharging without treatment, and primary wastewater treatment in the case of specifically eutrophication potential. We saw that container-based systems and advanced wastewater treatment generally had better performance across the specific metrics that we looked at. So overall, we see that moving away from latrines to other systems is desirable. Moving to primary treatment has some benefits from a safety and greenhouse gas perspective, but it should be done with caution given some of the eutrophication results that we found. Next slide. We saw that moving to advanced treatment has benefits, especially for eutrophication. There's a slight negative climate and ocean acidification impact for these systems. However, energy and operational changes could help to mitigate these impacts. And generally, we saw that moving to container-based systems was also beneficial. They could have a slight negative marine eutrophication impact due to the handling of urine. So urine diversion or changes in urine management could help to mitigate this. So broadly, some combination of these systems looks somewhat promising. Next slide. There's a number of study limitation and future research needs that I wanted to mention. So the container-based option is not widely used, as I mentioned before, so we really need to conduct additional research with systems that are in place to confirm the positive performance here. And then there's many other important factors, so this study should not be considered in isolation. We already mentioned the safety consideration, but also the cost of installation and operation, as well as the social or cultural acceptability of the sewage management options. And also this presentation and the model itself focused on global average conditions with some regional conditions, considerations, but decisions really need to be made with local or regional knowledge as well as models and priorities. So next slide. So to sum up, there are multiple options available for sewage management, and the current default option may not be the best environmental option. And we would just encourage decision makers to consider multiple different metrics when evaluating what sewage management option to implement, because these, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, these infrastructure decisions can have long lifetimes. So we should understand the different potential trade-offs of these different systems. Next slide. So with that, I would just like to acknowledge all of the study team at ERG, as well as CEA Consulting, who contributed a lot to this research, as well as our technical advisory group. We had a technical advisory group of 3 experts in the field that provided input at various points in the project and reviewed our study report as well. And I think with that, we'll go to the discussion. And Andrew will join for the discussion as well.
Great, thanks so much, Sarah. We've had a number of great questions coming in, a lot of clarifying questions. So I think I'll just start with some of those. Did you include composting toilets in this study?
No, we didn't. We considered it initially, but in the end, we didn't include it in the analysis.
Okay.
And to be clear, I would say that the container-based option does actually compost some of the solid material, so in a sense functions that way, but the user is not responsible for operating the toilet. It's a centralized composting. Or that's one way the container-based can operate.
Great. And thanks for putting the slide up. Yeah, so just as a reminder, you can put your questions in the question box, or I'll look for raised hands as well. So as things are coming up, I'll try to get you in line to call on you if you have your hand up. Let's see. So another question was about some of the scenarios. Did you address deep ocean outfall discharge in any of the scenarios?
Not explicitly, but for those communities, we paid attention to where population centers were and their distance from those that were 5 or 10 kilometers. We assumed direct discharge to the ocean. We modeled that as surface discharge, so we didn't capture that, but to some extent that deep ocean discharge is still in the zones where the continental shelf zones, the large marine ecosystems, where if there is sufficient mixing, it would be similar to a surface discharge. So not explicitly, but it is kind of implicitly there.
Great, thanks. There was a couple, a little bit in the follow-up question, but I think that you just covered that and what you were mentioning with the depth and everything. What category does the Pacific Islands fall in for the regions that you talked about? I think that was like about slide 16, not 9, no, sorry, slide 18. I think you talked when you talked about the regions.
We'll have to look that one up. So just, I mean, a lot of Pacific Islands are out there if there was a specific one of interest. However, this is all public information. So if you were to look at United Nations regional groupings, we can provide links, but if you look for United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, you could look up those geographic groupings, and you could also look for a World Bank. So I'm so sorry, we don't have that off the top of our heads.
Looks like Oceania is in there. I wonder if it would fall, if that's maybe a lot of island nations in there.
Right, right.
Great. So on the comparing impact slide, I think that was around slide 17, so maybe the previous slide. I think there was a question about open defecation being included on that slide, and are you saying that's a better or similar to tertiary sewage treatment?
No, we ended up including it because it is occurring today, but this slide really needs to be interpreted based on this arrow with movement towards safe sanitation. So we recognize that we're showing open defecation results, but there's sort of an understanding that movement away from open defecation is really necessary for human safety and dignity.
Right, and one last note about that is that at the scale we're operating, we could distinguish between urban and rural settings, and the the pathogen transfer there would be very different. but a dense urban open defecation, of course, is completely unacceptable from the safety and the dignity perspective that Sarah just mentioned, and we don't capture that at that scale.
Great. So there is a comment about including the study limitations at the beginning of the presentation, and there are no specifics. Maybe that's based on, I think you sort of talked about on the slide where you said what your metrics were and then your categories. So you did talk about, you know, the global aspect of the work. So I don't know if it's related to that, but any comments on that or?
No, just that you know, all of these results need to be considered in the context of the specific model. So I appreciate that comment and agree that it's important to consider the limitations of this specific model when looking at the results.
Great, thanks. Let's see. So there's just, go ahead and put in any questions you have. There's just some comments about coming in about the composting toilets on Toon Bay Island and how they seem to be working well there. And if the person who wrote in the question wants to come up, you know, like wants to discuss anything, you can raise your hand and I can call on you. Because there's just more comments. Let's see. You mentioned commercial sewage. How does that compare in impact to human sewage?
In terms of the scale of its impacts, just the human sewage we have actually captured. We didn't pay attention to whether the sewage that we're modeling was deposited in a household or a commercial setting. However, I think the question is probably about the additional components of commercial sewage, soaps and chemicals and other items of that nature. So we just included the impacts of human defecation, and certainly when you have nitrogen added to the sewage stream because of a detergent, for example, or other, you know, a food processing facility, you certainly could wind up having some of the issues we had would still apply to that, but we didn't model that. So in terms of scale, I think our report, which Sarah can talk about its availability, sort of puts our results in the larger context of those broader emissions. But we obviously didn't discuss that today, and don't have a, I think, quick answer for that.
Great, thanks. Sophia, it looks like you have your hand up, so I'll go ahead and unmute you and you can ask your question or discuss more on your comments. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, great, thank you. Fantastic presentation. I'm very impressed about the huge amount of data. And of course, we are hugely interested because we run a marine park with a fringing reef, which is very close to the lodge. And our concern was from the very beginning to avoid any sewage whatsoever. And 30 years ago, we decided for this composting toilets for, of course, defecation, and for any water, gray water, kitchen water, shower water, we built artificial wetlands, gray water vegetative filtration. So we can say we have zero sewage, and our reef actually really shows after 30 years no damage from eutrophication. Of course, we have coral bleaching and other damages, but it's still the very best compared to any other in the region. So I'm just interested to see why composting toilets has not been included in your study, because we consider this like the thing to go for the future in similar small settlements or lodges, hotels, coastals, because it's just working fine. Yeah, it's working fine. Though we did have, of course, at the very beginning, some cultural issues, because for people, it's of course not very easy to handle what they believe is, of course, poo, yeah. But after every season we empty the chambers, and what comes out there really is total compost. It's humus. There's no trace anymore of its original stage. So that problem has been solved already decades ago. So, and we are not separating liquid and solid. It's just all going into the same chamber. But it's important, the design is that it remains, and it has to remain in aerobic composition, not anaerobic. So it's not a wet pit latrine. It's also not a pit latrine at all, because it's falling on a grid. And there's a pipe going out at the back with a little wind wheel at the top, which creates a draft from the racing warm air. So it's aerated. It gets a lot of oxygen, which speeds up the decomposing or the decomposing and composting process quite a lot. So, of course, we needed some time to adjust the systems, a little bit trial of error, but we are running this for 30 years now, and it's doing very well. That was it.
That's great. It's wonderful to hear those success stories, and thank you for that specific example. I think it's sort of a unsatisfactory answer, but maybe come back to the point that we're operating, the study was at the global scale, and the technical advisory group felt that the extent to which composting toilets could be successfully adopted globally was relatively small. That is not to say, I mean, you've got a perfect example that you made it work, and you alluded to a little bit of trial and error, and you sorted it out. But the group felt that maybe, you know, people can install them, but maybe a large fraction within a number of years might be abandoned because of the issues. They don't do the troubleshooting, and they don't maintain the aerobic conditions. But clearly it works. So that would be a better, or we could augment the limitations to talk about, to really emphasize the fact this is broad scale. We're talking regionally, not on a specific island. And it's wonderful to hear that, that you've got that. And the wetlands too kind of fell in that category, but that's another great option. So I don't know if Sarah has anything else to add to that, but that's a great story.
Great, thanks. We also have someone else with their hand up. I'll go ahead and unmute Freya to ask your question. Okay, so you can unmute yourself, Freya, if you'd like to ask your question. Okay.
Okay, brilliant. So I was trying to unmute myself. Thank you, everyone. It's really interesting, and thank you for everything you're doing. I was one that asked the question about the comparing impacts chart, and I understand that you're weighing up different factors, but I'm still kind of intrigued. For example, are we saying that the red bars are the best or the green bars are the best?
Oh no, so the green bars do have the lowest impacts. So basically, across the options, the green represents essentially 0 to 19% relative impacts to the highest impact option, like highest impact sewage management option. So the green is essentially the lower impact options, and the red is the higher impact option. So obviously we talked about some of the downsides of pit latrine, so that's why you see a lot of red here. And again, open defecation, we found it didn't necessarily, when looking at our very specific environmental metrics, have the most impactful baseline results. But again, this chart really needs to be understood in the context of moving towards safe sanitation and this arrow as well, because open defecation is obviously not a safe management method.
No, absolutely, and the safety point is well taken. But the reason I even asked about the green and the red is I'm astonished that open defecation should be as low impact as it is, I guess. So that was kind of surprising for me. And then obviously container-based seems to be a sort of really positive sort of hybrid. And if one can get secondary or tertiary down, particularly on the ocean acidification front, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about those particular red bars in secondary and tertiary. then that would obviously be the most efficient method. Why was secondary and tertiary creating such problems ocean-wise compared to everything else?
Yeah, great points. I hope that you'll stay unmuted and tell us more about open defecation, why you think that it should be different in some of, excluding the pathogens, and I kind of alluded to that before, but in some of the other categories, if you think there should be issues with it, I'd love to hear that. But as far as the ocean acidification goes, Sarah mentioned this, the main problem is really emission of carbon dioxide, and to some extent methane, but largely carbon dioxide. And so if you're using energy for your process, you tend to have higher ocean acidification impacts, provided that you're drawing from a carbon-intensive grid. If you are running your secondary, tertiary plants on solar or geothermal or whatever, of course, that would be different. So that's the issue there, is the energy use to move the liquid, the solids around in those plants, to force them through membranes, et cetera. That takes energy, and that's where you get your carbon emissions in the current grid. Let's see, did I get everything? Sarah, please jump in as needed.
And maybe mention why open defecation is lower, Andrew.
Oh, yes, thank you. So in our modeling, Sarah mentioned this, when we put excreta into a closed container, especially if it's anaerobic, we wind up generating methane and nitrous, and those are reflected in the IPCC emission factors that we use particularly for the nitrous dioxide and carbon or methane emissions. So from that perspective, open defecation, just from a greenhouse gas perspective, open defecation doesn't have containers, it doesn't have anaerobic conditions, largely. And as I mentioned before, at the scale that we're modeling, we're not talking about hundreds of people openly defecating in the same spot in an informal setting. Of course, that would create anaerobic conditions. We're sort of modeling a rural user in a bucolic setting openly defecating, or the urban setting is not, again, it's not that dense. So we don't have, in our model, we don't create those conditions for at least greenhouse gases. There's no carbon, there's no energy use for open defecation. Although a lot of people live close to the coast, the way we modeled runoff and transport to the aquatic systems, we didn't wind up with a lot of nutrients reaching systems for eutrophication. Acidification and particulate matter are largely driven by both energy use and formation of ammonia. We don't have that with open defecation. So again, this is all in the context of the model. I think I'll just underscore Sarah's point that it needs to be in the context of the broader study. It needs to be considering safety, and the question asker acknowledged that as well. So it's really kind of just for a point of comparison and maybe academic discussion.
Understood. Thank you both very much.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. So we've got some more questions here. We can take a few more. Can you discuss the pros and cons of surface versus deep ocean discharge, and what depth is deep ocean discharge?
This is, I think I should start by saying it's outside the scope of the study. I think in the way that we want everyone to move away from open defecation, we would probably like everyone to move away from direct ocean discharge, whether it's deep or shallow. And so we didn't spend a lot of time looking at that. What I can say though is that I won't answer the last question, what is deep, but in the current modeling of eutrophication impacts, and only eutrophication, so we're talking about addition of nitrogen to marine systems, the majority of impacts occur due to processes at the surface level, and then the falling of that organic matter to the bottom where the hypoxia occurs. So anything that would allow nutrients to be processed by phytoplankton, et cetera. So if it's shallow enough for light to arrive, you could have a problem. I don't know what happens when you have really deep discharge and it just kind of stays below that mixing zone and that zone of high biotic activity. So how's that for a dodge? It's an interesting question. We didn't look into it. I don't know if there are safe ways to have that deep discharge, given given that this group is talking about reef health, I don't think we'd be anywhere near deep enough for that to be, if we're talking about coral reefs, we're not anywhere near deep enough for that to be the case. So it's an interesting question and worth some future work.
Thanks. So someone wrote that I was surprised to see that freshwater and marine eutrophication potential was relatively low for pit latrines. I work in urban environments where pit latrine waste is often emptied from the latrine and discharged directly to streams and rivers. Would that not result in higher eutrophication impacts?
Fantastic point. You're exactly right. Again, I fall back on the scale argument, which is that although that does happen, and we did model that, we do allow for some of the emptied material to be directly discharged to the stream. Some of it could go into a sewer and receive further treatment, as Sarah said. Some of it could go to land as well. When we talk about a regional population and where the people are, the number, the amount of excreta that's actually following that path directly from latrine to a aquatic body is relatively small. So this just underscores the point that Sarah made, that this all has to be done in a regional context. Just like the way that composting toilets make sense in a specific island, that's a great solution to keep material from reaching the ocean at all. In an urban center, the latrines certainly could have a higher eutrophication impact, especially if we're talking about oceans. If that urban center is close to the coast, then you really wind up with a lot of nitrogen reaching the water. So these are all excellent points, and a future model would be fantastic to have it even operate at a higher scale, so you could really kind of pinpoint hotspots and say, certainly don't do this here or do that there. At our level, I'll just very quickly, I'm sorry, we saw a lot of people on the webinar from Latin America, Caribbean. The Gulf of Mexico is kind of an enclosed large marine ecosystem, so impacts of nitrogen tend to be higher there versus the Pacific Northwest, where you've got a little bit more mixing going on. So even at that scale, that's the kind of scale that we're seeing regional differences, but we're not operating below that.
Yes, thanks. That makes a lot of sense. On the relative impacts slide, why was a sewer with no treatment considered safer than a proper septic system or container-based system?
It's not necessarily. These are sort of informally grouped up the ladder, but there's definitely some overlap, and septic system is considered a safely managed system, for example.
Okay. So it's just a factor of how it's laid out. You can't really overlap a lot.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't make any sense, right?
And I would refer back to the JMP Safe Sanitation Ladder for more information on the specific groupings of safely managed and so forth.
Great, thanks so much. We are about out of time now, so I'll go ahead and wrap up the webinar today. Thanks so much again, Sarah and Andrew, for presenting on the webinar and answering and lots of comments and questions. We encourage folks that join the webinar today to continue the conversation on the Reef Resilience Network Forum. It's an online community of reef managers and practitioners from around the world. You can see the link there to get to the forum. And next slide, if you haven't done so already, we encourage you to take the wastewater pollution online course. You can join the course through the link that's shown on that slide. I'm still seeing the forum slide, but I think it will advance. And to let everyone know that the course is currently in English, and we're working on translations into Spanish and French. So those will be coming soon in the next month or so. There it is. So there's the training link. And we do have another webinar coming up on April 25th. Next slide. If you can join us, it's called Applying Structured Decision Making to Inform Reef Management Decisions. And the speakers will share examples of how structured decision making has been used to progress several areas of strategic reef management. Please take the short survey that will pop up when you leave the webinar to let us know your interest in the topic of sewage and the webinar series. And we'll send out a recording of the presentation after the webinar. And thank you again so much, Sarah and Andrew. It was great having you, and really appreciate it to everyone who joined.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye.